Okay, cool. All right, before we get started with the code, I just wanted to give you a little background on this. Um, so um, we have an article about action buttons, right? But I think the focus is more on isolate and how isolate works, and action buttons are, just for instance, this is how you might use isolate.
Yes.
And I think that it's kind of become clear that um, action buttons are important enough and confusing enough that we really need a dedicated article. And the thing that makes me think that there's an issue on the Shiny GitHub repo, issue number 167, that now I think has 44 comments, uh, and it's all different people asking how to reset an action button's value to 0, and me saying you don't want to do that. And then somebody else saying, but I really do want to do that, and me saying, no, you really don't. Um, so it came up again last week, so I thought that we should let's try to do some better education instead of me just going to hand-to-hand combat with all these folks. um, and I want to preface it by saying that I do think that there is well, I heard someone say that they like to have strong opinions weakly held, and that's how I at least want to feel about this. That I've got a strong opinion on the right way to use action buttons, but I'm always open to be, um, for someone to open my eyes that I haven't thought it all the way through. But I do feel like all the cases that I've seen so far seem to indicate um, that I still have the right way of looking at the world right now. Um, okay. Any questions before we get started?
Are you going to go into more context about why people want to reset it to 0?
Yeah. So I thought the way I would kind of try to describe this to you is to start with some history on how this mechanism evolved,
Sure.
and then say this is how we really want people to do things, and then to go through some of the specific things that people were trying to achieve, asking for resetting the button to 0, that and show how I would prefer things to be done and why I think that that's better. Um, and I feel like some of this stuff, I know it, but maybe not so well that I can articulate it very clearly. So it's like somewhere between, like, I know it well enough to be kind of sure of the ideas, but maybe not so well that they really flow. So this might be a little bit choppier than our previous conversations. So
Fair enough.
okay, so to start with, let's just talk a little bit about the history. So when Shiny started out, it was very much about these reactive inputs coming from the user, right? Select inputs and slider inputs and stuff, flowing through reactive expressions and then into outputs.
Mm.
So everything is very this flow kind of happens, right? Um, and there was not originally any notion of, oh, I want a button to do something, right? In that world, with just what I described, there is no such thing as do something. There's only, I've given you calculations and you just update them whenever their inputs change. Okay. But then, I mean, we were like a month into the prototype before it became obvious, well, of course, people are going to want to wait until they've got all their inputs set and then hit go and then have something happen. So we introduced not action button but submit button. That's what came first. Okay, and submit button was a single purpose widget that all it did is basically said no other inputs on the page get to run until you hit the submit button. So kind of a hack, kind of just jammed into the front end, uh, in a not very orthogonal way, so that we could just get that feature working without really, thinking any deeper about it. And it turns out that that's a really poor design, that submit button ended up working only for very, very simple cases. And then
Right.
there were all these really totally reasonable cases that didn't work. Like if you had tabs, then it broke. It's ridiculous. If you resize the page, then, it broke. And all of those were hacks that we had to go back or we had to go back and do hacks just to get submit button working again. And it turns out that the submit button, I think, was just generally not the right approach. Okay.
Right.
Um, but it wasn't originally clear how you would do something like an action button. Okay. Um, so that world that I originally described, that's very reactive, very functional, where you just define these relationships between calculations and things just go. And
Mhm.
it's not your concern how often these things run. It's not your concern when exactly they run. All you care is that the user sees a reasonably up to date representation of these outputs at any given time. Okay, and the scheduling is none of your business. So that's I'll call that a very functional world, a very kind of reactive world. And the opposite of that is an imperative world, right? An imperative world is you saying, I want this thing to happen, and I care that it happens now or for some value of now. Okay.
Right.
Uh, and what was very, very unclear to me in the beginning was whether Shiny was going to be able to accommodate both kinds of logic. Can you have both this very reactive kind of logic, and also say, and when I hit this button, save it to a file, right? Like that was the original, I think, use case of action buttons was like write this to a database or something. You're not now setting up a relationship that always updates whatever. You're saying the user wants me to do this thing, so do it. Okay, so
Mhm.
that's a very imperative kind of functionality, and we kind of stumbled into the solution, which was this combination of observe and isolate. And just for the purposes of exposition, let's just review that real quick, okay?
Okay.
Um, let me, oh no, uh, I forgot. Google Hangouts for some reason does not pick up our studio windows anymore. No, I don't know why that is.
Oh, geez.
Um, okay, let me use my beta account. Let's see if that'll work.
Well, if you just do a screenshot with our studio in the screen, would it work?
I could, except it's such a giant resolution, and I'm on Linux, so to go change the resolution, I'm probably gonna have to edit some config file. I think this will work, though. I think this will work.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know what I have on here, but let's just try it. All right. Well, saved by our studio server once again. Okay. I'm in some weird project. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, there's a lot of cruft in here. Let me just install the latest Shiny. Ugh, sorry.
Sorry.
Wonderful. Okay, well I can start talking while this is going, or maybe I can't.
I like your imperative versus reactive dichotomy. I think
Yeah,
that really clarifies things.
that's a really really important distinction. Um, okay, so let me make sure that this is can we do our studio viewer? Okay, great. So I can say shiny.launch.browser. Oh, look at that completion. That is fantastic. Do you see that?
Hmm.
Oh, so amazing. Okay. Um, Let me just set up a little. Uh, a little app here. So UI is fluid page, and let's do. Okay, let's just not beat around the bush. I'll just have a action button here. Function output session any app UI server. Okay. Numeric input. Okay. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, that's just the UI. Okay, so let's say I want to do something very imperative, like when I hit go, I want to print n to the console. Okay, so we came up with observe to say I want to re-execute this code whenever something in it changes, right? So I could start out with print input n. Okay. So anytime this changes, I'm printing it to the console, right? But if I want it to just be the action button, only when the action button's clicked, then I have to say input go. Okay, so I'm depending on input go. And if I just did this, then sure, it prints every time I hit go, but it also prints every time I change n, and that's not what I want, right?
Right.
So that's how we ended up with this pattern. Where we are taking a dependency on go, but not on everything inside of isolate. Okay. And this gives us, for the most part, what we want, except that it printed without me even asking it to. But overlooking that, if I change this value, it doesn't print. I have to hit go, and then it does print. Okay. Even if n doesn't change, I can hit go to make it print again. So this is almost everything we wanted, except for that initial 5 being printed. And so I recommended doing this. All right. And then now let's run it. Okay. So good. It does not print when we start out, but if I hit go, it does print. And it doesn't print when I change n until I hit go. Great. So this is exactly what we want, right? And when I kind of stumbled upon this pattern, I was so happy. Like it just felt like, yes, we are able to marry these two worlds, and it works beautifully. Okay. I wrote a very excited email excited for me, to Shiny Discuss saying, look at this thing that I've discovered, and we should all be using this now if this is the kind of thing you want to do. But it is I intended for it to be a very, very specific pattern, okay, where you have exactly this, you test if this value is 0 and return, and then everything else you do, you put inside of isolate. And I don't think I didn't stress enough, and I certainly didn't make a case for why deviating from this pattern down that road lies madness. Okay, like it just gets crazy. So, for example, we have people who do a bunch of logic inside of here, but don't isolate at all. They just isolate individual aspects of it. And that way lies madness. And then we have other people who, okay, it's totally legit if you don't want to check for 0, if you want something to, like if this was not a go button, but like a update button, right? Then it would make perfect sense for this to be input.go. Like that. So you want it to happen initially, and then also when you hit update. But aside from that deviation, it really, like I feel like it doesn't make sense to deviate from this pattern here. Okay, and the reason is because, again, going back to this imperative versus reactive kind of dichotomy, right? If you have logic that's clearly imperative and logic that's clearly reactive, and they only intersect at these well-defined points, then I feel like the world can be sane. Like that's okay. If you have code that is kind of it's sort of reactive, kind of also sort of imperative, then it just gets really hard just to reason about your app as it changes. And Shiny apps, or I'd say, maybe this kind of reactive framework in general, because you don't exactly know when code is executing, you really need to, like, the code really needs to be set up in a way that you can reason about it. Otherwise, you're just going to be in for a world of hurt. Once things start not executing the way you expected, then you're just in for a lot of pain. So I think it's really important that we take these kind of well-defined patterns and try to stick to them. So, for example, we've talked in the past about how reactive expressions really shouldn't have side effects, right?
Right.
That's because side effects are naturally imperative, and reactive expressions want to be like this more functional state. So just like when you start sneaking uh, imperative stuff into reactives, you're kind of asking for a world of hurt. So too, if you're using this pattern that we've come up with for imperative code and you start doing reactive stuff in here, you're also asking for a world of hurt. Okay. So where does that leave us? Okay, so I came up with this observe isolate idiom. We documented it in the form of first a forum post, and then eventually you wrote that article for Shiny Discuss, and that's all great. Uh, but this is hard to read. It's unnatural to write. So what we really want to do is wrap up this pattern in an easier to write, easier to read format. So we've done that in Shiny 0.11 or something with observe event. Now we can do this. And these 3 lines, they are literally, exactly the pattern that I just showed you before. Okay. So if I run this, we should get exactly the same behavior. Yep, nothing happens. I hit update, it prints. Change the number, nothing happens. I hit update, it prints again. Okay. So this is exactly what we're looking for. And just to reiterate, everything inside of this expression is going to be isolated, so we won't re-execute this reactively. And whatever we put into this first expression is going to be what is executed. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. There's something I wanted to ask you, and this might not be the best time, but that handles the observe pattern. But if you wanted to make an aspect of your app, like a graph, update only when you click submit,
Yes.
you'd use render, not observe.
Yep. And that's a huge pain. Well, we'll come back to that in 1 second. Well, okay, no, let's come back to it now. Okay, so let's say we want to plot. Okay, this is where my story starts to fall apart a little bit. Okay, so what we really want is to basically do exactly the same thing. So let's make this a go instead of an update. So we don't want it to plot initially. So input. I think there was an edge case here, but okay. Well, let's just try it and see what happens. If input go equals 0, then return null, I guess. Just return, and then plot. I don't know, 1 through n.
Sure.
See that? Okay, let's try that. Okay, that does something. That did something. Okay. All right. So we were able to wrap up the observe isolate idiom into that nice little package. Unfortunately, we have not yet agreed upon a clean way to do the same thing for render plot and for rendering in general. So for now, you still have to kind of stick to this weird idiom, unfortunately. So, them's the breaks. So we did, however, so the third thing you could imagine, so those two were observe and output. And the third thing you could imagine is a reactive expression. So if this was like, random vals is reactive, and then you could certainly imagine this, and then this would be just random vals. So the third thing you can imagine wanting to do, isolate, observe with, is a reactive expression. And this one was simple enough for us to say, you can now do event reactive. So I can say input go, run if input n. Okay. Actually, this does actually make the render plot now, I think, for the most part. Let me just see what happens. Yeah. This does give us the behavior that we want. So our answer was really, if you need to do a render plot that depends on some go button being hit or whatever, do your best to use an event reactive instead, and make the event reactive the thing that you don't want to put like a plotting command in here, but
Right.
short of that, if you can do this, otherwise, yeah, we don't have a nice new function for you to tie go buttons together with render plots, at least not yet.
Well,
So.
Joe, here's a question that's coming to my mind. So both with observe event and the way you did event reactive there, it seems like the pattern you're encapsulating is the if this, isolate that. Why not just encapsulate that pattern in a function, and then you could pass that function to a reactive expression to observe or to render plot?
Yeah. So the reason was, it's been a while. This is vaguely from memory, but it was something like, with event input go, run if input n. I think it was, this is definitely how it started. And maybe it was because we couldn't agree on what this should be called. But there was some, or we couldn't explain how to use this thing. There was something like, sorry, I'd have to talk to Winston to try to piece together exactly why we didn't go this way. But I remember it being something like, we wanted the observe event to be as simple as it was, and then this thing, I had it called event filter. It was like this, and then you could use this anywhere. But somehow we were just not happy with how that was going. I don't know. Maybe we should come back to that. I mean, maybe that's how render plot should be. But boy, I really remember that we spent a lot of time on this, and we at least concluded that we shouldn't, not that we should never do it, but that we shouldn't have done it for 0.11. So I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't have a satisfactory answer for you.
Well, maybe it's because people could put multiple ones in a thing, and I don't know, would that's changed?
That would definitely be a problem for sure. Yeah, I mean, that is one nice thing about these very high-level wrappers, is that they're really hard to use wrong, or at least you hopefully know when you're starting to use it wrong. So okay, let's. Do you have any other questions right at this moment?
No.
Okay. Okay. So just to reiterate, the whole point of these patterns are to try to encourage you to keep the imperative and the reactive code kind of cleanly delineated. So let's talk about cases where people have. Oh, sorry. Let me also just point out. Let's talk about the implementation of Go for a second. So as you could infer from the earlier code, Go starts out with the value 0, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then every time you click it, it goes up by 1.
Mm-hmm.
And I originally did this just because well, I knew I needed the value to change, and this just seemed like the easiest way, right? Um, that I gave it no more thought than that. Like, what's the easiest way for me to send a value that keeps changing to the server? Just start it out with 0 and then change it. Now, unfortunately, this has, I think, led to kind of a misunderstanding about what this number is good for. Okay, so we had. Let me go back to my previous example. Okay, so people would see this and say, "Oh, well, I can understand that. That means when something hasn't been pressed, then don't do anything, right? Um, and if something has been pressed, well, then I want to do this." Okay, so it kind of led to this understanding of the value of input go as meaning 0 for not pressed, non-zero for pressed. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? This is about to get kind of subtle.
I could see why people think that, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, and that's actually not how I wanted people to think about this input go value. Um, the only reason that this exists is to distinguish between the first time this observer ever runs, right? So as soon as you create an observer, it schedules itself to be run, right? That's the only way it can even discover what its dependencies are. So observers have to run. That's just what they do. So this input go equals 0 is not to distinguish a pressed button from an unpressed button, but to distinguish the case where the observer is starting up and it's not in reaction to a button being pressed, right? And this is just a hack for me to get to that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so another way for me to do this I certainly don't recommend people doing this, but it's false. I want to take a dependency on input go always and then say if not, oops, sorry, I don't know what that was. If not ever pressed, then ever pressed equals true, and then return. Okay. I didn't have to look at input go. I could also have done this. Oh, this is text input now. And I think that this would have maybe not led people down to thinking about what the value of input go is. Okay.
Well, yeah, but then it'd count as being pressed the first time the observer runs, right?
No, because I'm setting it initially to false. So the first time I check it, it will still be false.
But then it immediately switches to true.
Yeah, it immediately switches to true, but this code won't run again until input go is pressed. And at that time, we want it to be true.
Okay.
Okay, so I shouldn't call this ever pressed. I should call it first run. So
there we go.
So if it is the first run, then yeah, sorry, that was misleading. So you can see when it first runs, it indeed does not print anything, right? You have to actually click it to oh, I did something bad. Oh, this should be false.
Should be false.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so what is my point with all this? Like, why does this matter? Okay, so the thing that people have been wanting is they've been wanting to set this input go back to 0. Okay, like somewhere else in the code, they want to say update action button go. It's like put go, something like that. Value equals 0. Okay, they want to change a button from pressed back to unpressed, right?
Right.
And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding about what these buttons are. So the way I think of it is there is no such thing as a pressed or an unpressed button. Okay, clicking a button doesn't put it into some long-lived pressed state, uh, there's no such thing as a pressed button. There's only a button, and the button can be pressed. That's an event. It's not a state. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The press button idea seems identical to a checkbox.
That's exactly right. If what you want to model is something that's either pressed or not pressed, that is called a checkbox, and maybe that's what you want, you know. But for these, the whole point of these buttons is that you can click them multiple times, and they will do stuff each time you click them, right? So that's not pressed state. Oh no, I'm in still pressed state, but a different pressed state. And here's a third pressed state. These things are by nature imperative, and that means instead you have an infinitesimally short event called this thing was pressed, and I want to do something in reaction to this thing was pressed. So I want people to stop thinking of this in terms of a state called pressed that's either on or off, and I want to set it back to off, and instead think of this in terms of when the button is clicked, you do something, and when it's, you know, not clicked, well, there's no, you just don't react. There's just nothing that happens. Okay. And observe event, I think, helps put people into the right mindset, because you say observe event, you say the thing that you want to care about clicks on, and then you say this code executes when the thing gets clicked. Okay. So does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about what some people have wanted to do with these buttons. Okay. When they ask for these things to be reset. So let's do one common theme is that they want to do a reset button. Okay. And they want reset to set go back to 0. So let's see. How do we? Let me think about what we want to do with this. What would we want to do when we hit go? So maybe we do the plot thing again. Okay. Or let's just keep it simple. We'll say we'll just print out some random numbers or whatever. Output. Oh, that's a little ugly. Output is render text. Wait, actually, this is more like my second example.
Well, we could render the go button and see what value it's at.
Yeah, that's right. Let's just do this. Maybe I'll only end up having one example. Okay, but let's start this out without any buttons. So this should be render print, maybe. Okay, so let's say we want to protect this output with the go, and then reset will clear it. Okay. Sorry, one second. This is illustrating something I wanted to illustrate with my next example. You know what? Let's do it this way. Let's do it this way. Let's say we have two different buttons. One that, okay, this is another common thing people ask for. Let's say one is to do a run if, and the other is to do an rnorm. Okay. So this would be uniform, and then this would be normal. And then let's make this a plot. Shoot, this is going to get confusing. Sorry, I told you I didn't fully have this thought out. So this is what people have tried to do. If input runif equals or not equal 0, Okay, plot r runif input n. Yeah, I've literally seen like this exact plot runif our norm. Oh, this needs to be hist, right?
Yeah.
Oh, and let's start this out with like 50.
Interesting.
You know what? We don't even need a number, right? We can just... Okay, so people have said, okay, well, I know that if my button is pressed, it's going to be non-zero. So when that happens, I want to do a histogram, right? With runif. And I know that if this one has been pressed, then I want this. Okay. So then people are asking, okay, well, let's first run it and let's see how it breaks. Okay. So I hit uniform. Oh, great. Then I hit normal. Oh, why is it sticking down like that? Oh, but now, now that I'm hitting uniform, it's still showing me normal, right? Oh, what's up with that?
Joe, can you resize your viewer window so we can see the whole thing? Because we all need to look at the environment.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh,
right?
so uniform is staying normal. Yeah.
It's staying normal, okay? And why is that? It's because once our norm is clicked, it's always going to be greater than 0, right?
Right.
So that's just not, it's just not
That's,
what we want, right? It's just like a broken...
that'll be the last expression.
Yeah, exactly. So people are saying, oh, well, you know what I want is update action button. You know, our norm value equals 0, and I want this run if value 0. Okay. And I just feel like even looking at this and trying to convince yourself that this is correct bug-free code is just hard, right? Like it just kind of hurts my brain to look at this and try to make sense of it. Yeah, well, I can't. Yeah. It's pretty rough. Okay.
In this, it does work in this example.
Yeah, but it kind of leads you down. It's not obviously correct, at least to me. Like I find this kind of logic now, it's very difficult to kind of...
But wouldn't you want to switch back to 0 runif when you click after you're done clicking the unif button, and switch r norm and r unif there?
Maybe.
So it's almost like when you, I forget the function in R, but when you write a function, you could do on close, set things back to the way that you store when you started the function.
Yeah. Okay, so if you do that, so in this case, let's say our norm is clicked. Okay, runif is 0, so it skips by that. Our norm is 1, so it goes down here. It sets runif and our norm back to 0. Runif hasn't changed, so fine, that has no effect. Our norm now changes to 0. Well, you just changed our norm, so we're going to come back into render plot again. And it's going to, this time, plot nothing. Right, like the act of setting our norm to 0 is going to cause this entire render plot to trigger again.
Yes, okay, yes.
And I mean, I think this is why, you start making the slightest changes here, and then it's like, what the hell? Like, it's so hard to think about these things. So let's see if we can give ourselves the effect that we want in a different way. And the stipulation is that we can't look at the value of our runif and our norm. We can only use observe event or event, reactive, whatever. Okay. So, you know what? Let's even add another one. Okay, so I can think of a number of ways to do this. Let's have one be reactive values. And then we'll say data equals null. Okay. So if input runif is clicked, well, first let's do this. We'll say if the data. Oh, let's use our validate need like this. And then just the data. Does that make sense? Okay, in case, yeah, let's just. Okay, this makes sense, right?
Right.
We're going to park some data here. So we'll say uh, if runif is clicked, then we want v data to be runif. Let's do 100. It's our norm. We want it to be our norm 100. And if it's clear, then we set it to null. Okay. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I can't say I've ever done anything like that before.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and try it. Oops. HR. Uniform, normal, clear. Normal. Is that normal? Yeah. Uniform. Okay. Okay, so this actually appears to work correctly, which our previous incantation did not. And it's pretty straightforward, right? Like I would have bet $20 before we hit run, other than that stray comma, that this was going to work correctly.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's fairly easy to reason about. You've got 3 imperative event handlers. When runif is clicked, data is now runif. When rnorm is clicked, data is now rnorm. When input is cleared, you just set it to null. And since this is kind of the beginning of reactive, functional kind of land, you can feel pretty confident about this too. If the data is not there, then return. Otherwise, just histogram it, right? So to me, I look at this and I say, this makes a lot of sense. And it's scalable in the way that the previous one was not scalable. You can reason about it. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so is this the solution that you advocate?
Yes. So, well, I mean.
Or is this a straw man?
No. This is, I think this is certainly a valid solution. I don't think the particular way that I'm handling vdata, this may not generalize to any number of problems, but the observe event does. This is the key thing that I feel like, observe event, it's important that people, base their solution around observe event. If you want to use the reactive values in this exact way, do or don't. It doesn't matter. Okay, well, let's say another way to do this would be, let's say the logic in here is sufficiently complicated that you don't want to just, like let's say you're just cooking up, you're affecting one element in a relatively crazy reactive graph or something like that. And this doesn't have to be data equals null. This could just be mode equals null. Okay, and this would be saying, mode is now runif. Mode is now rnorm, and mode is now clear, which will make that the default. And then you could use these things somewhere else or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, the point is not so much to advocate for this specific solution, but to illustrate that there's almost always a way to transform poking and prodding input $go with observe events that mutate state. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think
Okay.
one reason this might not have occurred to people is at least in my experience, I don't normally create reactive values other than through an input function.
Yeah.
So maybe you weren't aware that's possible.
That's absolutely critical to this approach. Because the set of things that you can do in an observe event, they all have to be like imperative type things. If you want to affect reactivity, you need to use one of these. You need to use the reactive values. Or the the alternative to having reactive values, like $v mode, you could also say make reactive binding mode, and then this could just be mode. Maybe this has to be like this, whatever. But you usually are going to need to use one of these two things, either reactive values or make reactive binding.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. So that is one example. Oh, okay, shoot. Now I have to remember. What was the other one going to be? Oh, okay. So that's one thing that people have wanted is these kind of dueling buttons where you really care about the last one that was clicked, right? Like when you hit clear, it should not be uniforms code that executes and then normal. So this is just showing how you can achieve that by setting reactive values. I really feel like I'm not explaining this well, but hopefully, at least this idea that you can figure things out using observe event will make sense. By the way, I was picturing, like this conversation can be the start of kind of planting the seed for you. But I think the output that we eventually want, the article that we want to basically enumerate as many different examples as we can of, look, this is what real world users were trying to do with input $go, and this is how we would really, here's how we would prefer that it be done. Here's how we think it's simpler and more robust to do it. So
makes sense.
Okay. So another thing that people have wanted to do fairly commonly. Actually, do you have any more questions about that last one before we move on to the next?
Well, the only thing that keeps occurring to me is even what we're doing here. I mean, this would be a checkbox group or a set of radio buttons.
Totally. Yeah.
So is it really just to preserve the nice aesthetic you get with an action button versus the other widgets?
That might be part of it. I also think that people who have not done any kind of UI programming before, they're not used to thinking about the semantics of these different controls. For example, it's been asked several times on Shiny Discuss how to take a series of checkboxes and make sure that only one of them is selected, which that's called a radio button, right?
Right.
And I think just people are not used to necessarily thinking about those controls and what they're for. So yes, in some of these cases, you do want a checkbox. I think like in not how this example ended up, but how it was just before I changed it to this mode instead of data. Well, let me just undo our way back to. Oh, good Lord. Okay. In this particular example now, what's different between these and radio buttons is that I can keep clicking this over and over, and it'll give me new values of uniform, whereas a radio button, not necessarily. Well, no.
Yeah.
Like you can't just keep clicking on the radio button, or at least that wouldn't be obvious to anyone, even if that worked. It's weird that these are appearing latched, though. That seems like a bug. Or that's just the focus. Oh, that's the focus. Okay. But I think you're certainly right that there are other cases where people are using these buttons this way, and really it could be a tab, it could be radio buttons, it could be a number of other things. So that's a good point.
I guess what's behind that question is, do you think that maybe we're missing a widget, like an action button group?
Oh, that's interesting. That hadn't occurred to me. Yeah, that might be really interesting.
Or maybe get away from calling it action button, just call it button group or something.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what the other examples are like.
Yeah, okay. So I only have one more off the top of my head.
Okay.
And this one is people saying that they have like different modes that they're switching between. And when they switch modes, they want to clear. So let's say they have a plot that's relatively expensive to calculate. And there's like 3 different modes of plot that you can create, but it's the same plot output. Okay, and then you've got a run button that controls all of them. And when a user switches from one set of inputs to another, indicating that they want to switch modes, well, you don't want to immediately plot. The fact that they've switched means that, well, now they haven't set their inputs yet, so you have to wait until they set their inputs and then hit go again. Okay. So let me just let's just do it, and then we'll see.
Okay.
So this one's going to be a little more setup. So for the page, sidebar layout, sidebar panel, main panel, do an output plot. And I want one button to rule them all here. Okay. And then let's do tab set panel inside of the sidebar. This is a little contrived, but just go with it. ID equals tab set tab panel. So this one will be called. Let's just go with our stupid runif type thing. Okay. Uniform. So this will be plotting with uniform numbers. Sorry, just 1 second. I can't stand that option. Sorry. Okay, so uniform, and then if for uniform, we'll just ask what n is, basically. So we'll say numeric input n number of values. I'll just say count. You know what? Let's do a range too. So let's do a slider input. Sorry, I told you there's going to be a lot of setup. So min negative 1,000, max equals 1,000. And then the value will be from negative 100 to 100 by that. The next tab will be normal. And then we'll do the same thing. Right. Does this make sense so far?
Yes.
Does our norm take some, standard deviation, so I can, I can't give a range for the R norm, right? I just need to give a mean and SD. Okay, perfect. So numeric input norm mean zero, and then numeric input norm SD. All right, and then server input output session. Sorry, I should have written this in advance.
Makes it easier to parse for me.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. What did I miss here? Format. Terrible error message. Gosh. Okay. Why is this? Oh, because it's because my window is so small. Okay, great. So we have no plot yet because we just haven't done it. but there we go. So we would want to be able to hit plot, have a uniform plot appear, and then when we switch to normal, have it be blank, rather than immediately plotting the normal. Okay. Quick plot, render plot, and let's say, see, what I really want to do is something akin to what I was doing before, but for the sake of shoot, I wanted to illustrate something that's going to force me to do this in kind of a suboptimal way. All right, you know what? Let me just do it the suboptimal way. It's just going to be gross. We'll work through it. Okay. So let's jam all the code, all the logic right into this render plot. Okay, I wouldn't normally do this, but to illustrate this point that I want to make. So let's start by making this ignore the plot button altogether. We'll say if input tab set equals normal, then we'll do okay, so if tab set normal, then we want to take, oh, sorry, I did uniform first. So if it's uniform, then I want to make how many of these? I need to make unif count number of them. So I'll do runif by input unif count. Okay, that gives me the right number. And then I need to scale it to this range, right? I'm sure there's a really nice way to do this, with R in some single command. But actually, stop me if you know what it is.
Well, the next two arguments of runif are min and max. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. It's easy.
But I'd be interested to see where you're going.
Range 2. Yeah, I was going to do some math. It's better. Oh, that's right? Unif range 1 and 2. Okay, let's just assume that's right. Otherwise, we'll do an rnorm of input, rnorm count, or I guess norm count, and then input norm mean and input norm SD. Okay, does this make sense so far?
These go be yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to do something. Good. Let's switch to normal, and now, yep, we're getting normal looking stuff. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now let's get it to obey the plot button. And we'll just use our old-fashioned if input go equals 0 return, and this whole thing inside isolate. Okay, great. So it's not plotting until I hit plot. Perfect, right?
Right.
But then when I switch, let's see what's happening. When it's switched, it doesn't clear, and we want it to clear. And it also, there's going to be this weirdness when I resize it. It's going
to... Here you go.
That's terrible. All right. So what do we want instead? Let's say when we switch, we want it to clear immediately. So people were saying, oh, I want to, when I notice the tab switching, set input go back to 0. And we could do that. The case is a little weaker here, I think. But what we really want to do is this. Input. Sorry, this is exactly what I was working on when I told you I needed to postpone. and I had it in my head, and now it's gone. But I'll figure it out again. Input tab set. Okay, so what we basically want to do is, let's think of this in terms of events again. We want this observe event kind of model. So rather than set this to 0, we want to introduce some new variable and have input go affect it. So let's say, let's not use the reactive values this time. This time, let's just use sorry, what is it called? Reactive binding. So we'll say do plot equals false. So initially we'll not do a plot, and we will make it into reactive binding. So have you worked with make reactive binding before?
No, and I was wondering if you could tell me where you'd use that instead of reactive values. Like, what do they do differently?
The only difference is, if I were to use reactive values, then everywhere I want to read or write it, I would do the $do plot.
Because it makes a list.
Yeah. And if you're only making the list for one variable, then wouldn't it be really nicer if you could do plot, assign it this way instead? And that's what make reactive binding does. It says take this one variable, like a normal looking variable, and continue to have it look normal, except when you read or write, it's a reactive read, and when you do a write, it's triggering all the reactive stuff. Okay. So it's really the same as a reactive values with a single value.
You don't need to use the double arrow for that, do you?
I only do because this is a different scope. So if I were to do this, it would set a local variable, and I want to refer to this variable, so that's double arrow.
Okay, let me.
Sorry, maybe this is causing more confusion than.
But no, it's not. I just want to make sure I get straight. If you used reactive values and you had $do plot, would you need the double arrow?
Right. You don't need the double arrow in that case, and that might have been a mistake actually in the way that I implemented that. Oh no, it's not. It would be akin to don't think of V as a list. Think of V as an environment.
Oh,
right?
Is that what it actually is?
It's close. Yeah. I mean, because a list is passed by value, and a environment is passed by reference. So certainly reactive values is much closer to an environment than it is a list.
Does that mean every time you mention V afterwards within that server function, it's going to go to the reactive values environment?
So V is its own little reactive environment, basically.
I guess I don't quite see why within observe event it wouldn't just create its own object named V and ignore the fact that somewhere out there there's an environment named V.
Oh, that's just not the way environments happen to work. So when you have a, let's go back to here. This V dollar data is definitely going to read from this V, right? That makes sense, right?
Yes, yes.
And just because of the way $sign is implemented, this is saying call the function call the function $assign on V, and V is passed by reference. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can just chalk it up to being a quirk of R, that this will behave differently depending on whether this is a list or an environment. Okay. I'm actually not 100% sure that's true. You might want to ask Hadley. But
I'm just trying to figure out if it's a quirk of R or a quirk of Shiny.
Oh, no, yeah. If you think of this as new.env, then it's perfectly consistent with R.
Okay, yeah. I can follow that.
Yeah. And if you think of this as a normal variable, then this double arrow is also perfectly consistent with R.
So one thing that Hadley sort of stresses, and I guess his best practices, although I think this might have changed recently, is unless you know what you're doing very well, don't use the double arrows operator.
Oh, interesting.
But now it seems like we're saying, well, but if you're programming Shiny, just use it.
It might be like dealing with nested scopes like this is so natural to me because I've been doing functional programming for a long time. But certainly I think for the vast majority of casual R users who don't even think about the fact that a function makes a new scope, double arrow absolutely could be, causing trouble. But okay, you know what? I feel like it is kind of. I don't want to conflate one confusing thing with another. So
Yeah, let's just. In the article, I would definitely stick with just one version all the way.
okay. So let's say this do plot is false. Okay. I'm going to do this with a bug purposely first, and then I'll fix the bug. Okay. So, well, maybe you can tell me. If not, do plot return. Oh, B. Okay. So this event is going to fire anytime the tab changes. This one is going to fire anytime the button is clicked. Okay. Can you guess what's going to go into this line here?
So the word observant. So that would just be. Well, I guess we take the RUnif line from down below and put it up there. Well, wait. You want to change? You want to write into do plot? Would you write a plot into do plot?
Well, we can. I'm just checking for false here.
Okay, so
Okay,
true.
try this. Okay, certainly starts out empty.
Okay.
When I hit plot, it appears. When I switch, it disappears.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
following you now. Yeah.
Okay, so this is giving us some of what we want. But here's the bug that I intentionally put in. If I hit plot again, nothing's happening, right? Because do plot is already true, and I'm just setting it to true again, and in Shiny that has no effect.
Right.
So I need to make this something that's going to vary every time. I'd like to have a function in Shiny called like nonce or something like that, just to make it clear what you're doing, but this would have the same effect. So gross, but
Well, there's a chance it might not have the same effect.
right. There's a chance.
Well, that's almost a shame because input go, when it's 0, R will read that as false, and when it's anything other than 0, R is going to read that as true.
We could also just do this.
Yeah.
Whoa. Hold on. Oh, no, sorry. So this is all wrong.
Yeah. This.
So if this is going to be a number, then if it is, this is what I wanted. Sorry. That was weird. Let's try that again. Okay, so this gives us what we want now, and I think this is exactly right now.
Oh, well, I think it'd still work even if you took out equals false.
Oh, okay. So you can
Unless
a number
there's
there.
some coercion thing. But yeah, with number change 1 to 2 to 3, but all those equal true. And
oh, hold on. It appeared at first. Why did that appear? Oh, this should be if not. Sorry. Okay, you're right. That works. All right. Okay, so once again, we've kind of, this is a little less compelling, but still, I think it's much easier to understand than if we were to introduce update, update action button or whatever. I still prefer this kind of mode where you're making explicit that you have this variable, this reactive value, and it has very specific semantics associated with it rather than with input go. I mean, in this particular case, it's pretty close. Obviously the semantics here are very close. So, honestly, this is not a great argument for, I think it's almost like, yeah, in this particular case, it might even be slightly better just to say update action button here. But it's just so bad for the other cases, the update action button. It's so dangerous. Whereas I feel like this doesn't add too much overhead and it encourages people to think the right way. Um, so, yeah.
Well, yeah. So I guess the consequence is we have to set up this infrastructure V.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And maybe that's part of, like you were saying, the fundamental problem here might be that we have not conditioned people to be using these reactive values, and maybe there's a deeper education problem about you know why and when you might want to use these. But they really, I mean, they're relatively rare, other than when you're doing imperative type stuff. That's let's just close a circle here with the like we said before, the dichotomy between fully reactive stuff that's input and whatever. Um, so that's one world, and then you've got the imperative world on the other side. And there's really, I think of it as there's two ways these things can interact. You can either want the imperative world to trigger some kind of reaction
Mm-hmm.
in the reactive world. So like you want the imperative world to influence the reactive world, or you might want a reactive graph to trigger some kind of imperative action. Okay, so like either world can enter into the other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the way that the imperative world can influence reactivity, the way imperative can enter into reactivity is using these reactive values, and it's really almost the only way that can happen. Um, and if you want a reactive expression to result in a side effect, well, that's or in some imperative action, that's what observe is for. So to go from imperative to reactive, you need to use these reactive values, and to go from uh, reactive to imperative, you need to use observe.
Yeah, I'm writing that down. That's good. I do have a question for you after this.
Yeah.
Um, then observe. Yeah. So in this case, we're taking a reactive values V, and we're just assigning false to it. I know that input $go must be similar to V $duplat. Can we just assign false to input $go?
No. And that is exactly what people are basically asking for, and what we're not allowing.
Is there a reason for that? Because you'd have to update the display if it wasn't an action button.
Um, do you mean in general? Why do we not allow inputs to be set?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a good reason. I just want to know what it is.
Yeah. The main reason is because the result of setting, if so, we went out of our way to make input not settable, unlike reactive values. Under the hood, they're quite similar. So we actually went through some gymnastics to deny you from setting them. And the reason is because these are like variables. Okay, they just reflect whatever was the last value you stuck in them. These are a proxy for what's happening in a client, right? That's a very different kind of a value. So, like, let's say, forget Go, but if it was input $tab set, right? That's supposed to reflect which tab is currently selected in the UI. Should you be able to just say input $tab set equals null? Like, what does that even mean, right?
Yeah.
So when you want to change those things to make it clear that you're not just updating a variable, we let you call update tab set panel or whatever, right? That's how you change the value of input tab set, is by telling the client, change your state to this state, and then just like the client always does, when a value changes, it sends it back to the server, and then you will get your new value for input tab set. Does that make sense?
So, okay, you've probably heard this question before, and you might not like it, but if we do that with tab set, why not do that with action button?
Yeah, exactly. And the reason is because the fact that people care about input goes value other than it being zero in the first place, or the fact that they want to set it back to zero, um, I just think that there are so many cases where that's the wrong thing to do, where you'll basically fall into the pit of failure by doing that. And this Untitled 3 was the example that showed why. Um, because people want to do things like inside of their well, actually, so like let me give you another example of like an anti-pattern that I saw. It was like literally inside of an observe, if input go 1 equals 0, and then if input go 2 equals 0. No, I think he had not equals 0 and do something. Right? Um, so I feel like we already went too far down the wrong direction by letting people even think about writing things like this. So I really feel like you should only be doing like this from now on. The only correct way to use it, a button, is to call observe event on it. And if it weren't for backwards compatibility, I might actually programmatically enforce that, and like not let you read the value of go1 directly or something like that, because I feel like it's so dangerous. And letting people update those values back to 0. Like if you use observe event, then there is no reason you would ever want to set go1 back to 0, right? So by letting people set go1 back to 0, I feel like it's opening the door to even more abuse of these things when we're trying to move people away from that kind of usage. Well, that said, this particular example, I'm going to have to think about it a little more because I feel like this makes a particularly weak case for this restriction. Because we really do, like in this case, it does feel like we're just setting it back to 0. So,
Yeah, it does. But
yeah. What I can definitely prove is that you don't ever need to set it back to 0. There's always a way to work around it. But just then the question is, what's worse, making people work around that restriction or letting them, through the gates to a place that they don't want to ultimately be?
yeah. Well, it sounds like we're on solid ground with this approach, and I guess the update action button's still shifting sands. Maybe it'll be more clear in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I don't, it might not be the like update action button. It might be that there are legitimate uses, but I feel like 90% of the times people have asked for it, it was really not going to be, it wasn't going to be happy. So
I'm not surprised.
so hold on, let me see real quick here. Well, here, let me send you. Oh, can I do a text chat in here? Here's Shiny issue number 167 on GitHub, and this is the one of the places where this has been captured. There's also at least a couple of Shiny Discuss threads about this. But you can see, like, two buttons, B1, B2, when button is pushed, it's increased by 1, then it must be reset to 0, whatever. You can definitely imagine now how you can do that with observe event and reactive values, right?
Yeah. Wow. This goes on forever.
Yeah. Switching locations, working directories. Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like the most helpful thing to do would be to explain a little bit of the background, and then go through each of the things people want to do, show the best practices for doing it, which you just showed me,
Yeah.
and then maybe title the article like "Best Practices with Action Buttons" or something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that for sure the background has been missing for people who are trying to get into action buttons in the first place. Um, and then yes, if it could also serve the dual purpose, or even if it was a separate article saying, patterns or recipes for action buttons. Yeah, I think that would definitely be helpful.
Patterns or recipes. Yeah, depending on the length, it'd be
Yeah.
very easy to split. Yeah.
This same thing applies for action links, by the way. They're literally the same as buttons with a different look. And I
Yeah,
feel, yeah,
I've
go ahead.
seen them, but I've never seen anyone use an action link. Right.
Yeah, yeah. I think it would have to be, you know, like if you want to update a plot or recalculate values or something like that, that's a very buttony kind of thing to do. Um, but like you could certainly imagine like a clear these fields, being a link or something like that. Something that's eh, literally anything you want to do that's imperative. It needs to be one of these action somethings. And I just
Yeah.
thought that there certainly might be cases where a button is too heavyweight for whatever subtle action that you want to do. So
Yeah, I guess maybe if, especially if it's integrated like in a line of text or something. But to me, the idea of clicking a link that doesn't take you somewhere else is.
yeah. Well, I had one for I think it was like one of those leaflet examples where you can zoom around the plot and then to say like go back home, like that's not necessarily a button kind of a thing. That could just be saying I want to navigate the bounds back to the continental U.S. or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. But other than
So
that, they work exactly the same, right?
yeah, they should work exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I I think I could work on this on Friday. Is that too long a wait, or?
Oh, there's no. It's just whatever works with your schedule. Oh,
What?
sorry. One other thing I just want to call out. Uh, it's also not uncommon, I think, when people try to work around these kinds of things, instead of using a reactive values, they just use a normal variable. I think mostly because they haven't heard of reactive values before, um, and that's quite dangerous as well. Not dangerous. I mean, there are legit reasons to use them, but you certainly should consider whether you want a reactive values instead of just a regular variable. And I think 9 times out of 10, you probably want a reactive values.
That makes sense. I know I've tried to do the normal variable thing myself. Not that I got it to work. I obviously didn't, but I
Yeah,
could see the. Okay. All right. Well, I think this will be really useful. And,
cool.
thanks for putting this out there. I'm kind of coming off a place myself where I've I'm finishing building these huge courses, and now I'm looking for ways to make smaller items that we could, like articles, cheat sheets, that sort of thing.
Yep.
So when you have ideas like this, it makes me really happy, and it makes my life easier because I don't have to decide what would be useful. You're telling me what's useful.
Yeah. I think one of the sorry, there's at least 2 or 3 topics that came out of the advanced Chinese workshop I gave in LA that
Hmm.
I felt really embarrassed that we had not bothered to write down. Like we'd built these things and not bothered to write them down. Um, so I should go back and just make sure that we've hit all those. Do we have one about debugging? Like here's how you debug Shiny apps. I can't remember.
We have something, but it's basically like put print statements in your Shiny app. It's
Okay.
pretty old. Um, I'm not sure what the state of the art is for debugging. That might be a good brain dump in another
Okay.
week or so.
Sure. Yeah. Do that. Oh, I've gone all blurry.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Okay, cool. Any final questions?
No, but if I think of any while I write it, I'll just reach out to you.
For sure.
Is Slack the best way to get your attention, or email?
Uh, Email, Slack, text is really the surefire way, but I hate to. I feel like such a prima donna saying like, "Oh, you need to text me if you want me to read your emails."
You mean on your cell phone or in the sidebar?
On cell phone. Oh, actually, IM is pretty good too. So IM for sure is more immediate than Slack or email.
Do you mean Google's built-in IM or AOL IM or?
Oh yeah, just Gtalk. Google's. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, that's good to know. It seems like everyone looks at different things, so it's good to know who looked it
yeah,
up.
yeah. I'm trying to get better. I've unsubscribed from like almost every GitHub repo, so the volume is hopefully going to decrease over time, but I still haven't gotten a handle on it. So sorry.
Dude, I can't imagine if you're watching the GitHub repos, that must fill your inbox faster
Yeah,
than.
yeah. And the problem is that there are like probably at least 8 or 10 repos that I legitimately have to look at all the issues and read all the comments and stuff. Like I actually need to be on top of them. So it's not making it easy right now. So it's all right. I'll figure it out.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. This was really helpful for me.
Thank you. Oh, and then one other thing. I feel like we did a brain dump. Maybe the most recent one where I couldn't get it recorded, and you had a video of it instead. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that was when we were talking about modular apps.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And what we came out with after that was we never published it because it's like, well, this works, but doesn't feel like the best way yet.
Okay. Okay.
That makes sense.
Can you do me a favor and just send me the video anyway, if you have it?
Yeah, let me find it. It's probably fairly big. I'll put it on Dropbox and then.
Okay, that'd be great. I just want to have them, and if it's not, um, you know, worth putting online, then I won't put it online. But yeah, I'd like to have them all, at least in the library.
Okay, and I think I did write that article up. So if you decide that approach is something we could share with people, let me know and we could publish it.
Okay, cool. All right, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Let me know if
Thanks,
anything
Matt.
comes up.
Sounds good. All right.
Bye.